are excited to welcome you to tonight's panel event, Activism, Elections, and Changemaking in 2020. We would like to remind you that tonight's event is being recorded. We're going to be posting to YouTube after this. We ask that you mute your mics and turn off your cameras and save any questions for the Q&A portion at the end of the event. So 2020 has been a year of great uncertainty. Over 200,000 Americans have lost their lives as a result of the coronavirus pandemic, in large part due to the federal government's failed response. And millions of others are now jobless and struggling to meet their basic needs. All the while, billionaires and corporations have continued to amass more wealth and more power, expanding the country's unsustainable gap between the rich and the poor. The tragic trend of extrajudicial killings of Black men and women has served as a powerful reminder of the lengths that we still need to go to dismantle the racist structures upon which this nation was built. We have begun to experience the worst impacts of climate change to date, with wildfires ravaging the West Coast and extreme weather devastating other parts of the country. And during the most important election of our lifetimes, we have a president who has refused to accept the results of the election and encouraged his supporters to intimidate voters, and a Republican Party that has centered its political strategy around voter suppression and reducing faith in the electoral process. And yet, in this uncertainty arises an opportunity for lasting change. This summer witnessed the largest mass movement for racial justice in the nation's history, with millions participating in protests following the murder of George Floyd at the hands of the police. Young people across the country are demanding that our politicians fight for racial, social, and economic justice. The change that we demand may come from many levels, from access to voting and electoral reform to mutual aid, direct action, and community organizing. Our panelists will discuss these matters and hopefully provide a greater understanding of how to best affect lasting change during these chaotic and trying times. Our moderator for tonight's event is Professor Jamillah Bowman Williams. Professor Williams received her JD from Stanford Law School and her PhD in sociology from Stanford. Her work focuses on contemporary bias in law, the effectiveness of anti-discrimination law, and the law's capacity to promote social change. She has researched the Me Too movement and the impacts of social media on activism in the 21st century. Before joining the Georgetown Law faculty, Dr. Williams worked as an associate in the employment law practice of Paul Hastings in Chicago. Professor Williams is currently teaching a seminar on public policy and activism, where students learn about contemporary bias and how to influence legal change. Thank you so much for joining us. Professor Williams will now introduce our panelists.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me. I am quite excited about this discussion. So I'm going to start off just by introducing our esteemed panel, our three panelists here. Okay, so first we have Assemblymember Lorena Gonzalez. Gonzalez is a member of the California State Assembly, representing the cities of National City, Chula Vista, and parts of the city of San Diego. She was first elected in 2013, and she is the first Latina in California history to chair the Assembly Appropriations Committee. She's also chairwoman of the Select Committee on Women in the Workplace and chair of the Latino Caucus. Prior to being elected to the Assembly, she was a labor leader and organizer, serving as the first woman and the first person of color to be elected CEO and Secretary Treasurer for the San Diego and Imperial Counties Labor Council, AFL-CIO. Assemblymember Gonzalez is a graduate of Stanford University and has a master's degree from Georgetown and a law degree from UCLA. Okay, welcome, Assemblymember Lorena Gonzalez. Professor Paul Smith is a professor at Georgetown Law and the Vice President of Litigation Strategy at Campaign Legal Center. Smith graduated from Amherst College and Yale Law School, where he served as the editor-in-chief of the Yale Law Journal. He's an experienced litigator and has argued 21 cases at the Supreme Court across a wide range of legal areas, particularly focusing on civil rights and civil liberties. His important victories include Lawrence v. Texas, the landmark gay rights decision, and he's also argued numerous voting rights cases, including challenging strict voter ID laws and partisan gerrymanders. In 2010, the National Law Journal named him one of the decade's most influential lawyers, and the ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice gave him the prestigious Thurgood Marshall Award for his work promoting civil rights and civil liberties. And last but not least, we have Mr. Calvin Johnson here. Calvin Jackson. Mr. Jackson is a native Washingtonian committed to organizing around social justice principles within the DMV area. After graduating from Georgetown University in 2015 with a degree in sociology and media studies, he started organizing around ending youth tobacco use and healthy food alternative policies. He currently works with Rising Organizers as the Community Engagement Director and with the Public Safety Coalition and the Mutual Aid Movement DC as a core organizer. So welcome to you all. So I'm gonna just start with some questions, bouncing some questions around, and hopefully it'll be interactive and you all can speak to one another, and I'm gonna take questions towards the end from the audience as well. Okay, so the topic today is activism and elections and change making in 2020. We are coming off of our first presidential debate last night. Everyone is talking about it, largely not for good reason. The election process was one of the big topics discussed. And what we know is that there's a lot of misinformation out there. Many citizens are really lacking trust in the election process right now. So I want to start out by talking about that a little bit. So for Assemblymember Gonzalez, how concerned are you about this going into the 2020 election, and particularly when we're thinking about marginalized communities? So particularly in a time where in-person voting poses a likely health risk with the COVID pandemic, and that's falling more heavily on certain communities. What are your thoughts or concerns about elections within that broader social context?
Well, you know, I think what we're seeing is really the Republicans engage in a new form of voter intimidation. It doesn't look like what we think of voter intimidation at first, because it comes in terms of warnings or these stories, but it really is. And so in a state like California, where we have passed, God knows, a number of laws to try to make voting as easy and accessible as possible to every single citizen who's over 18. You worry that in this year, when we're trying something new, honestly, although we've had vote by mail for a very long time by request, we are sending every registered voter a ballot in the mail. And this is at the same time as we have 2 million new voters because of automatic registration. So we know that there are a number of new voters out there, people who have no experience with our electoral system, or people who had no experience with vote by mail, who are suddenly going to get a ballot in the mail. We want it to be successful, obviously. We want them to feel empowered to utilize that as a form of voting, and not to feel like their vote won't be delivered, it won't be counted, it, you know, is somehow going to be accused of being fraudulent. It's a scary idea, right? When people can really, and sometimes it seems silly to those of us who have voted our whole lives and done these things, but it can really get people to be paralyzed. Somebody's got there. It can get people to be paralyzed in actually voting, because there are so many worries and concerns out there. I think every story that the president talked about yesterday has been proven to be false. We know that voting by mail is safe, that it's secure in California. There are so many. We actually have the system by which you can track your ballot, make sure it was actually received. If you get a no match because your signature has changed, they have to inform you of that. You have a chance to correct that. I mean, it's almost a fail-safe method, as long as people don't become so afraid that they just simply don't vote. So it's a new form of voter intimidation, I think.
Okay, great. So that hits on a lot of important issues, and some of the steps that states can take to try to help aid this process, such as automatically mailing out, sending these mail ballots to voters. Following up on that, what are some of the steps that students or other people can take, given that we know that there's mistrust and misinformation, and people may be more challenged than usual given the different options and everything involved? What actions can we take at the local and the state levels in order to increase accessibility and engagement in this very high stakes election? So what can we all do to help in this process in terms of getting people out, getting people informed, getting people involved? So I'm going to start back to you, Assemblymember Gonzalez, and then I'm going to follow up with Mr. Jackson on the same question.
So two things I think are really important, especially for students, because you're probably dealing with people not only in Washington, D.C., but maybe your home state or in different areas, maybe Virginia, Maryland, depending where you live, depending where you're doing your work. There are two things that are really important. One, understanding the rules in each state. They vary state by state, and understanding what people's rights are, it is super important. I could never go tell people in other states what they should be doing, because California has, you know, you can register to vote up until the day of the election. I mean, we have everything you can imagine in order to reduce barriers to voting. So knowing the rules about those people that you're targeting is super important. The second is for us to stop, those of us who have been involved in elections for a long time, to stop thinking of GOTV and election day as election day. It is, in some states, the ballots are already out. In some states, they'll be coming out very soon. Election day is almost now a 30-day period. And so informing people of the rights, walking them through what they need to do and ensuring that gets done is not a knock on the door, go vote kind of situation. And so maybe I'm showing my age because maybe it hasn't been that way for a long time, but I know when I started in politics, and for a long time in politics, we thought of getting out the vote as election day. It's so clear that early voting and vote by mail really extends it, and we need to do our work today.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. So hopefully the students are all tuning in to these different these different tips that we're going to get throughout this evening. Okay, now on to you, Mr. Jackson, because you are a grassroots organizer and you focus on this concept of mutual aid. So this is, I think, maybe right up your alley too, but can you just start out by defining what mutual aid is, how you would define it, and broadly what it does for communities? And then I want to get into how it may intersect or interact with the political process.
Yeah, so yeah, mutual aid in general is the community using its collective power and uses its numbers to crowdsource resources. In this case, during Corona, in our case, it started out with food. It started out with reaching out to a bunch of food distribution centers, going to pick up food from public libraries, from public schools, reaching and using like the community as volunteers. And so we had almost 70 volunteers who was able to dispatch, that we were able to dispatch and drive, deliver, meals and whoever to people. And I think an important aspect of the mutual aid movement was that it's about centering the community as actors in their own lives and as actors in change. I think it was here in DC. I think it was unfortunate that our mayor had a press conference and they asked her, right in the beginning when this Corona thing hit DC about where, some of the resources are from the government and how is she reacting to coronavirus. And she wasn't able to provide an answer. And it was kind of unsettling that she provided links to community-led resources on the DC government page, as opposed to the DC government delivering these and distributing their own resources with, that without taxpayers' money. And as you mentioned in your introduction, or someone mentioned in their introduction, the only reason why these things exist is because of necessity. It's because the government has been unreactive and initially, especially in the beginning stages, totally inept with delivering anything to people. Most of our constituents that we serve with the mutual aid movement with youth and senior citizens. I remember, and this isn't just, this trickles down from the mayor to the council members. Our specific area that we work in here in DC is Ward 1. So it's a bunch of neighborhoods. Some of our high target areas are Columbia Heights and Mount Pleasant, full of Hispanic people, Black people. It's a mix of affluent buildings. It's really an interesting place because you have public housing right across the street from, a condo. we were serving one particular apartment building, and there was an issue because we couldn't get in to the apartment building to deliver. Some woman needed diapers, and so deliver her diapers and deliver her lunch meals. But the people who owned the building were saying that it was going to be a exposure risk, but they also weren't helping the subsidized tenants get any resources during this time, like during this crisis. And so, you know, we had talked to someone from the mayor's office. We talked to the people that owned the building. We talked to council members Brianne Nadeau office. We found out that the people who own the building are, you know, they are a campaign donor of Brianne Nadeau. Brianne wasn't able to make any assertive kind of moves or anything that was proactive enough. That was, you know, she couldn't tell them allow us to get on the property. She recommended that she sent an email recommending that we are health workers or safety workers. We should be allowed to help these people. We ended up like negotiating the process and we basically kind of had someone, train someone to be an organizer and had them come out of the property, get the stuff from us, and then go back into the property. And so we were able to kind of find a loophole. But it was unfortunate that it was all of this bureaucratic red tape that was surrounding this building that basically created this oasis of issues within this building. And this woman organized, she was also they don't have like a tenant association or anything like that. And so she was just an admin person in the facility. At the time, she even like had a messed up leg. And so she had to kind of, on this messed up leg, like provide these resources for her community, and like, you know, God bless her. But it was, for these people, it was like, where's the government? You know, where's the ANC? Where's our council members? So mutual aid, especially over the last like 5 months here in DC, has been really, really critical, especially for the people in my community up here in Ward 1.
Okay, so that is very helpful for the background. And what you're explaining is that mutual aid and these community members are filling in the gaps that are left by the government that aren't serving some of the needs of the community members. And then also largely by some of this distrust in the government and distrust in the political process, maybe, that they won't fulfill some of these core needs. Are there any ways that you work along with the government, or could be a supplement to the community process, or to the political process? Or do you think that there's always going to be this sort of division or divide?
Well, politicians they serve their constituents. And if, you know, Brianne Nadeau, for instance, she supports us in a lot of ways, and then there's a lot of ways that she don't support us. She shows up, and I think like rhetoric and symbolism, for instance, is important, but that doesn't always translate to hardcore like policy. I think, you know, for instance, you have politicians who are really good on issues of policing in terms of their rhetoric, but they won't propose to redistribute funds from policing to other things such as housing or education here in DC. There's plenty of examples of us working with her. She was a big supporter of the NEAR Act, which was neighborhood engagement achieve results here in DC. It was a big thing, but the mayor didn't fund it, and so it was never wholly implemented. But she was a big torch holder for that. But that's another example of how, you know, the political system is very gridlocked. You know, our Mayor Bowser, deploy police on her constituents here in DC. I was part of the protest down on U Street where people were kettled by her police officers. But then they'd go on to television the next day and kind of reprimand Trump's kind of deployment and Anthony Barr's deployment of actual military on, you know, protesters, when this, you know, Black mayor who's just was featured on CNN as like one of the leading Black mayors in DC, you know, she painted Black Lives Matter on the street, and then the next day, like, her police kettled protesters under the pretext of a curfew that was clearly and obviously meant to counter protesters' efforts. So, I mean, we have to work with the government because there's a system, because this is the system, but the government is also, these people work for us. And, you know, there is almost no space for them to say, you know, they don't want to work with us. I remember there was another meeting right when the coronavirus hit, or right kind of in the middle of it. It was a closed door meeting with all the council members. I read it in the Washington City paper. It was basically about business. It was business meeting. A bunch of business leaders wanted to talk to the council members about how the phases are going to be opened up, but it was just like business leaders. No notes, no time stamps, no anything. It was a closed door meeting. So I sent this email and tagged a bunch of my co-organizers to our Ward 1 council member, basically asking her, what is up and what was her reaction. She deflected and was like, read the article. I think the notes are in the article, and I repeated what I just stated. The article stated this is a closed door meeting, and then she got really repulsed. She was like, I can't work with you all. You all are very conflictive and blah blah blah. This isn't working. For a council member, for an elected official to tell constituents this isn't working, it was very agitating. It's your job to make it work. I think it's your job to serve the community. If community members are worried about businesses opening up and resources, institutions opening up quicker than what it needs to be, we as community leaders have a duty to ask you that question. I think it's completely out of step and shows the dissonance and the disconnect with everyday working people and some of these elected officials to get mad at the prompt of someone asking you to open up these notes and what was your reception. So again, I mean, it's their job to work for us. It is her job to make it work.
Yeah, so I hear a few things. One, just continuing to express what your voice is and your grievances are and what your demands are, and to hold the government accountable. They work for you and the constituents, and to follow up on those things. So I teach my class about the principal policy gap, where politicians and others will express something symbolically or in principle, but they aren't following through with the policies or the actions needed to make those real changes. So when you see that gap, then you do what you can to try to close them or have some accountability to close and follow through on the policies needed. Okay, great. So let's switch over now to Professor Smith. And we talked a little bit about the state and local initiatives, Assemblymember Gonzalez did, and then Mr. Jackson talks about the grassroots. Let's now talk to you a little bit about the role of federal courts in all this. And let's go back to the issue of the voting rights. So we're thinking about voter suppression and voting right generally, and some of this accessibility. What's the role of the federal courts, and what should we be paying attention to here, or which change should we be pushing for in that realm?
Well, I have to say that the pushing for voting rights through the use of the courts has been a sometimes successful business, but often unsuccessful. It's one of those areas of civil rights law where the courts have more often in recent years been part of the problem than part of the solution. If you look at the leadership of the Supreme Court on that has been quite remarkable. If you shutting down part of the Voting Rights Act, approving voter ID laws, saying we're not going to do anything about gerrymandering, just case after case. And I contrast this with, I did a lot of work for about 20 years on the LGBTQ rights movement, where we had a phenomenal record of changing hearts and minds, and therefore changing courts and changing legislatures. And in some ways, the difference, I think, is there was no zero-sum game when it came to giving equality to same-sex couples. We just convinced people that it didn't make them any less happy that the people down the street had more protection and more rights. And once people started to figure that out, it wasn't as difficult a problem. Whereas in voting rights, what you have is a group of people who think that if we give more voting rights to these people over here, that's going to diminish our power over here. And it becomes a perceived zero-sum game, and they have their sort of myths about what's really going on. If people of color are getting more power, it's because of voter fraud or theft or whatever, and we need to maintain us real Americans in charge. And so you have this really static situation. The court is really not going to fix this problem. And this is an area ultimately where I think democratic power has to be exercised. And people just have to start overcoming the burdens to vote, electing a government that is dedicated to opening up the democracy. And there's one scenario under which, despite all the darkness of this year and the new problems with the Supreme Court and everything, that we could end up with a Democratic Party running both the legislative and executive branches, an end to the filibuster, and some really positive legislative change at the national level to affect all of the problems with our voting system, which our voting system is just rife with difficulties. But a lot of it could be fixed if the federal government in the elected branches would just focus on it and get it done. Then there will be some interesting tension with the new, very conservative Supreme Court. But let's try it first and see what we can get accomplished.
Okay.
I'll stop there.
Okay. No, that's great. You sort of answered one of my future questions that I was going to ask you about the Supreme Court. That's fine. I actually think I'm going to ask you a little bit more explicitly, even though you partly answered it. So because everyone's talking about the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court vacancy left by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and then Amy Coney Barrett is the potential next appointee for the Supreme Court. So it sounds like you're saying that that will have implications for voting rights and some of these other things, but there's an opening for Democrats to take the executive branch and the legislative branch to maybe counter that. Can you talk us through a little bit more explicitly what you see happening if that does end up happening, that if Amy Coney Barrett does end up becoming our next Supreme Court?
The truth of the matter is, the area of voting rights in particular, I don't know that the addition of one more conservative justice is going to make too much difference, because they were already 5-4 pretty terrible, with the Chief Justice voting, leading the charge on a lot of things. The Shelby County case, for example, the big destruction of the Voting Rights Act. One thing I do worry about is, though, the Chief Justice may, the court may end up helping to decide who won the presidential election. And I actually had some faith in the Chief Justice would not countenance an actual theft of the democracy. But he's no longer the fifth vote. So it could have some short-term effect in that context. But what's really going on is the Democrats have recognized that the reason that they're not nearly as powerful in our government is all kinds of things that keep a minority of people in charge. A combination of gerrymandering and terrible campaign finance laws and a whole variety of other things that have meant that the emerging majority of people in this country have been held back. And if we can finally get in and fix things like voter registration and gerrymandering and campaign finance and have some public financing and a whole variety of other things that are in what's called HR 1, which passed the House last year, is ready to get passed again, we can do a great deal to make the policies of this country match the views of the majority of people in this country, which they have not done in a long time.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you for that. Okay, I think this is a good place to take it back to Assemblymember Gonzalez. And this goes back to what Alex brought up in the beginning about the widespread protests we're seeing, all of the activism against racial injustice and police brutality. So I want to think about that a little bit. And we can anticipate that this continues on into election season as well with all of the conflict that we're seeing. So tell us a little bit about some of the work being done at the state level when it comes to racism and law enforcement and more broadly. And then I also want to think about for people who are out there protesting, maybe many of our students, when they're advocating for those types of political changes or policy changes, what can we do to support them as well to protect them from retribution from the police and, other officials, et cetera?
Well, I'll say, being in California, we have been really lucky in that the silver lining around the tragedy of George Floyd's death, and so many before him and so many after him, is that it seemed to wake up, what was the term you used? I'm going to have to use this, the disparity between what people say are their values and do as their values.
The principal policy gap.
Policy gap. Well, we've got a lot of, unfortunately, a lot of more moderate Democrats who suffer from that, even in a state like California. And it really bridged that for a short moment. You know, there was a lot of pressure. There was, because of sustained protest in the state, there was a number of bills and legislation that we were able to get through as a result of that, including a review and a look back we have on the ballot now of our horrific decision to ban affirmative action in the state 25 years ago. That would have never gone through, but for kind of this civil unrest, justified civil unrest. We got some police practice reforms, in fact, just signed by the governor today, that included getting rid of the chokehold, that included ensuring that there's an independent review of police shootings. So there was a lot that kind of the momentum grew out of that. Now, it's interesting because now there's the pushback to that, right? We're already starting to see the pushback. I had a bill, in fact, that died in the Senate that really sought to protect I always say our kids. I have a 24-year-old who was out there protesting, felt this strongly. And, you know, it was a bill to say, like, we need to standardize the use of kinetic projectiles that are supposedly less than lethal. We need to standardize the use of tear gas, or actually ban it is what it tried to do. We need to ensure that the police, when dealing with protests, peaceful protests, can't just declare it a riot and engage in violence against peaceful protesters. That bill ended up without a vote in the Senate, in the California State Senate. No other state got even that far on some of these, like protecting our protesters. We try to deal with the kettling issue that we heard about earlier that the DC mayor used. This was happening in every major city with Democratic mayors, with, you know, people who would in fact stand up and say one thing and then allow kind of, you know, beyond their control what the police did. We're still going to have to work towards that. But I would say this, it was interesting. One of the things that came up, I think, in the debate that you could even hear about last night was like, will you tell your supporters that you agree to the election results and, you know, peaceful protests? You know, I believe in peaceful protests, but I hope if we don't win this election that there's protests in the street. I hope we realize how important this is. The kind of the things I tell my daughter and I would tell students is the protests, and we need to keep them peaceful, you know, as much as possible. Obviously, peaceful when it comes to individual bodies and lives, but they have to be sustained. Right? It was the sustained weeks of protest that helped get some of that change in California. But that's what we need to continue. It can't be a one-shot deal. This can't just, you know, make yourself feel good by showing up, because unfortunately, because of our loss of the courts, because of our loss of some state legislatures, if we lose again the Senate and the presidency, that is really our only voice. That is our only hope for change, I think, because we have so many other struggles. And so it's really up, not just to the next generation, but they're the leaders. You all are the leaders. The students are the people who are pulling us along. I mean, I kind of am, I think some of us are kind of that you know, I grew up and went to college in the mid to late 90s, and we, you know, maybe showed up for an anti-war protest, but we did some stuff on ethnic studies. We did some stuff, you know, that we cared about, but it wasn't what you're seeing now, and it wasn't the 60s, but we need it to continue, and we need it to be led by young people. So I hope people don't accept. Obviously, we have to accept in a democracy, whoever wins, wins, but I hope they don't accept that as normal, as okay, as acceptable, that we're going to continue with 4 more years of kids in cages, of police beating down people, police killing people, state-sponsored violence. We cannot accept that, and that only changes, I think, because if we lose everything.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's something that concerns me too. As I study social movements and contemporary social movements, from the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter movement. It tends to follow this boom and bust cycle where it goes up and everyone's into it and then it sort of fades. So we're hoping it'll be sustained, but only time will tell, right? Because that sustained action and being in the streets and really shifting and changing the empathy around some of these issues, like it has to continue, or otherwise people get distracted and go back to what they're doing and forget about the policy change that we'll need. Okay, so taking it on to Mr. Jackson then on this question. So thinking about the protests, and the fight for racial justice and the mutual aid movement. What role has the mutual aid movement played in that context, if any, and how can students get involved in that way as well?
That's a good question. I think that in DC, a lot of the mutual aid movements that was created, the pods, a lot of the mutual aid pods that were created by organizers in DC who are already a part of certain types of work that's already working on the equity issues that these protests were reacting to. Without like mutual aid, for instance, I was already working on safety issues. In Columbia Heights, there had been a bunch of shootings here in Columbia. There's literally a specific block where there's almost a shooting, I feel like every other week. And we were basically just trying to get a bunch of the organizations in Ward 1 who work on these safety issues to kind of come together and pool their resources, which is in itself another form of mutual aid. A lot of, there's a lot of these organizations work in silos. The gun violence people don't work with the housing people don't work with the youth voting rights people, the youth voting rights people don't work with the green space people or what have you, but all of these things are connected because they're all about equity. But they don't work together. So we were building a coalition that was trying to put these people in the same room. When the crisis hit here, it was good that we started that because it kind of forced us to leverage all of these relationships and to getting food to our community that we were all serving. And so it was really good. Obviously the crisis itself was a bad disease, and I think it exposed a lot of contradictions in our democracy and capitalism, but I think it forced us organizers to kind of pivot and build like these mutual aid structures that we hope can exist once the Corona thing died down. So specifically when the riots and stuff was happening, we would use the opportunity to go down. I would use the opportunity specifically to go down and we created like little infographics, some QR codes, and was basically asking a lot of the people to donate money to our movement or to volunteer with us. A lot of people was receptive. Once they heard it was a mutual aid, some people didn't really know what mutual aid was, but a lot of people, when they did hear it and they did know what it was like, yeah, immediately, I want to donate, I want to volunteer. There was a lot of these rallies were being held by people who aren't from DC. There were a lot of students from, I've seen a lot of undergrad students, but I'm sure there was also probably a lot of graduate students as well that was leading a lot of this stuff. And for me, it was, I think at first it was very, as an organizer here, a lot of these people don't reach out to people from DC and the people that have been doing the work already in DC. And I think that you can take up space and try to occupy space and help perpetuate a negative kind of image about the organizer community, organizer space or movement, what have you, the Black Lives Matter movement, whatever, in DC without building that bridge with the people that's been doing the work. So I think it's important that people want to get involved. So I took the opportunity to go down there and try to mobilize these people who have good intent, but to the point that was made earlier about Ms. Gonzalez, how do we make this sustainable? Like, how do we make this not a boom or bust thing? And mutual aid and building these structures is one way to do that. And so we got volunteers from this who've been helping us. We have specifically, I'm on the money-making team for Ward 1 mutual aid pod, which is different from the MAN BC, which we helped created. But again, like all of us organizers have been in this work already, and it's just, it basically forced us to create these structures so that we can react to stuff like shooting or stuff like a virus.
Yeah, no, that's great. Those are great, really great tips, because there are already structures, there are already organizations, there are already efforts, there are already initiatives. So instead of reinventing the wheel or just coming and showing up and just being present, they can connect on and have more concrete support or action that they can do to help further missions that are already there and have very well thought out and created by members of the community who really know what they need. So that's excellent, and I hope our students hear that, because I do think that will help it be more sustainable if they can connect into these existing efforts. Okay, let's take it. I want to make sure to leave time for Q&A, But I did have another question for Professor Smith, and that is about the link between some of the grassroots organizing and student activism as well, some of those things, and then the large scale, just the broader national efforts or legal efforts around voting rights for in particular, or for example. And I want to take it back and connect it back to your work on the LGBTQ rights and changing hearts and changing minds. You talked about that. And I think that's another one where some grassroots activism and getting people involved and getting just the broader population to care about these things. How do you see them linked, and what can happen to help them link up?
Well, there's no really meaningful civil rights change in this country that doesn't involve both activism at the grassroots level and then leadership in the legislatures and in the courts. That they all mutually reinforce, and unless you put pressure on people, they're not going to really change. On the other hand, you know, how do you get the activism going? Well, sometimes it's triggered by horrible, tragic events. Sometimes it's triggered by court actions, which say to people, maybe this is something we can actually work. And so there's a lot of interesting cause and effect interactions between grassroots activism, judges and lawyers working in the court system, and then ultimately lawmakers like the Assemblywoman here. And so, you know, basically there are three legs of a stool, and if you really want to make change, you need all of those. And we've seen that over and over again, LGBT movement, but you know, there's talk of meaningful legislative change, not just in California, but around the country on the police killings issue, and that's only because of the activism that made people pay attention for the very first, well, not the first time, but certainly the most effective real reckoning with the truth about all these facts. And so, you know, I just think that we have a wide range of experience on this panel, but we're representing different aspects, the three different aspects of how change gets made in this country. People at their local level saying, I'm not going to put up with it anymore, and getting organized. And then people who have litigated civil rights cases and people who legislate them. So that's you know, and any of those three things missing, you're just not going to get it done. So I hope that was responsive.
Yes, it was, absolutely. You linked it all together, which was actually a great way to kind of conclude and take it to the Q&A, because I do want to give a chance to the students and other community members who may be present to pose questions once given we have you all here together and have these different perspectives. So we're going to ask you to use the raise hand function if you have a question for one of the panelists that you would want them to address. So think about your questions, use the raise hand, and in the meantime, while we're waiting for that, maybe do you all have any final thoughts, I guess, or particularly recommendations for the students? If you have already come up, but are there any final thoughts or tips or advice that you want to leave them with before we get to the questions?
Well, I could say something, Professor. Seems to me, one thing that people really need to recognize, this looks like a really dark time we're passing through. And I think a lot of what the Trump administration is doing is trying to scare people and make them think they're powerless and get them to not vote and stop pushing for change. I mean, even like the post office thing, I think that was more gaslighting than anything else. And all this talk about the legislative theft of the election, maybe it's real, but maybe it's just supposed to get people to think their voting doesn't matter. So we have to react to all of this stuff by just getting madder and making sure that everybody we know gets to the polls, everybody we know stays involved in the movement for Black lives, and you know, not let them deter us from actually staying angry and staying active.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to agree, just say I reinforce everything that Mr. Smith said, that about the connection and the necessity for like the law, organizing, and then having these leaders and these political positions that are that are following through with the stuff that they say on the campaign trail. I personally, like, when I got into undergrad and got into Georgetown, I got in really kind of inspired. And I wanted to be a lawyer. And I used to work at law firms in high school, as, you know, as an HR assistant, or working as kind of, I worked at it was a high school model where you had called Crystal Ray Networks, where they kind of put the students in these like corporate firms once a week. And so I worked at Jones Day in Silly Austin. And it was really cool to be around these lawyers. Every time I talked to a lawyer, they were like, told me, don't be a lawyer. So I got to Georgetown and I got really dissonant with politics at that point. I, you know, felt like, you know, I felt like there was nothing to show for Obama's legacy in terms of for Black America specifically. And that this idea of, like, you know, Black faces in high places don't always translate into material policy. It is true that Trayvon Martin and Freddie Gray and Sandra Bland, these people died with and lost justice with a Black president, with a Black attorney general, with Black mayors, Black chief of police, these elected officials that were Black. But after I graduated Georgetown and got reconnected with organizing, I got reconnected back with politics in another way. And currently I want to go back to school, and I'm going to apply to Georgetown Law, Howard, UDC, Law School, Harvard, and Berkeley. One thing that kind of inspired me, that kind of brought me back to that, was I went to one meeting with Empower DC, and there was a lawyer named Aristotle Teresa, and he was suing the zoning commission here in DC for the adverse impact on the displaced community. I, you know, personally, as I said before, every lawyer I ever met was just like, don't be a lawyer. And to kind of get reconnected with organizing, and to, you know, find this, you know, this Black male who's in charge of this Black law firm, doing this really radical, radical case, and then to meet other lawyers that he know, obviously, that's also working on this stuff. It was just really inspiring, and it kind of, you know, getting back into organizing and meeting these people who's working in the streets and working with the people that's getting, you know, displaced, that's experiencing this whole catalog of oppression. It really just reignited my fire around law. And so I've been, recently I've just been studying for the GRE, because I don't really want to take the LSAT. A lot of schools now take the GRE. And there's also like a clear need for lawyers in our space, in the grassroots space, but there's just not many of us. Most people who, you know, again, most people I met who's lawyers working at these big banks, you know, I have teachers that work with, at Lockheed Martin as their attorneys and stuff like that, you know, and that, you know, I want to sue the government for war crimes. I want to sue my local zoning commission for gentrification. And to see lawyers who's doing that and to meet them and read these books, like once I got replugged in with organizing, it just re-inspired me. So yeah.
Well, that's awesome. And you will be a great law student and great lawyer. We need more lawyers from the community with the goals and dreams and passions and interests that you have. So we need that. So we try to link. Many times we aren't from the community and of the community, so we link, but it's different when you have that background and that is your experience and you have both toolkits. Okay, so do you want to say anything, Assembly Member? And then we have a question.
I'll go to the questions, but I just want to point out, Calvin really said some important stuff about organizing. And sometimes I even forget, you know, I was an organizer before I ran for office. I came out of the labor movement. Being an organizer and being involved in true organizing, and allowing the people from a community to lead in that organizing is the most important sustaining work you can do. And so I do want to remind folks of that. And sometimes it's not in your community and you're not the leader. Sometimes it's in your community and you can be more of a leader. But that is essential work to in order to sustain real change. It can't be done through politics. I mean, I'm an elected official now. I ran for office because I was sick and tired of electing people who weren't doing what they said they would do, specifically in the labor sector. You know, people would come forward and say they cared about workers, they cared about these things, get elected office and lose their mind. But I always have to remind people too, like, we're just people. Elected officials are people, and you cannot put all your faith in elected officials either. You need, as a professor said, the three-legged stool there, the organizing and grassroots, the elected officials and the courts. And so just do not miss out on that organizing portion. And if you ever are like, I don't really, and this is valid, I'm gonna tell people this now. It's valid to say, I don't really know what organizing is. In fact, that is probably the most valid thing you could say, because I think a lot of people throw around the term organizing without really understanding it or knowing it or having ever really witnessed it or been a part of it. So you can find a lot of groups, whether they're community organizations or labor unions, that do real organizing and volunteer through those organizations to try to understand what deep and meaningful community organizing really is. And I highly recommend that. And I hope Calvin goes to law school and not gets deterred by corporate lawyers. We didn't all go that path.
Yes, lots of options. Okay, and same for our students in this space, and hopefully they know that if they're here in this meeting. Okay, Orlando, we have a question from you.
Yes, hi. Thank you all so much for your comments and your insights. When it comes to, the relationship between direct action and, bringing challenges in the courts, et cetera, and changing hearts and minds, kind of making your case. It strikes me that, with the example of, the LGBTQ movement, that the case there is like a more emotional one. I don't think that most judges, most courts have like a really strong understanding of, gender and sexual theory. Whereas their political theory, their theory of democracy, I think is probably much more developed. And so, and it's also just kind of more heady. There's an emotional appeal in Love is Love that is, seemingly absent or more difficult, more abstract when it comes to kind of defending democracy. And so my question is, how should we think about kind of educating ourselves and educating our communities, kind of creating that lasting dedication and connection to those communities, to mutual aid movements, to organizing, and to kind of connect it to those, our need to educate ourselves, and so that we can come to a consensus about what we're pushing for, what we're fighting for. For the entire panel, but I'll, particularly to Mr. Jackson and to Professor Smith.
Well, I think sometimes the people who are leading the charge at the court level or at the lobby in Congress, something kind of lose touch with the grassroots part of the movement, and it is an effort that needs to be made to constantly go back and say, is this what we're seeking? What you really need here? There's been a greater understanding, I think, in recent times that leadership ought to come from the people who are in need of the help, not from the people who think they know what they need. And so it's something to always keep in mind.
Could you repeat your question? Are you asking what is the space that like emotion and cultural change has in organizing?
Well, if you have, if you have an emotional appeal that you've made before, that people have made to you, that has helped you crystallize, what exactly you're fighting for, I'd be like, that would be very helpful to me. But I'm more generally asking about, how do we kind of unify our education with our direct action, so that these two things are mutually reinforcing. That, through helping people, we're also educating ourselves and educating those around us, so that, we can build kind of a theory of what we're fighting for.
One thing we teach, so I work with Rising Organizers, and we teach people how to organize. And one of the frameworks that we had, and we're somewhat moving away from, but it's still kind of the core of our framework, is that, there's different tenets for what organizing is. You need to center the people who are affected by the issue. It needs to take multiple people to do it, right? You can't organize around a broken window, but you can organize around a perpetually underdeveloped and under maintenance building, for instance. And the last thing is, like, it needs to be about policy change as opposed to culture change. And so we don't teach, so we teach, like, having a book club about racism isn't organizing, right? But taking that book club and then bringing in organizers as a panelist, for instance, is organizing, and connecting those people to the organizers who's doing the work is organizing. And so, and think the question I think that someone answered your question. I think it's kind of connected to that, because that's an example that we're actually doing with Rising Organizers, is taking the idea that people consume so much information, they don't know how to employ it. That's kind of what got me into organizing, is reading about like neoliberalism in Black communities, reading about or working in the space of the nonprofit industrial complex, and realizing like these, nonprofits are gridlocked with some of the things, or limited in some of the things they can do, because they're not centering the people that's affected by the system. And so we made this book club to really teach people how to deploy this information that they're consuming in these books. The first book that we are hosting is Angela Davis, Our Prison's Obsolete. The answer for me is obviously yes. But we have a bunch of people recently who has come on board with this idea of abolition, and redistributing funds and whatnot, but they don't know about how to get involved with that. They've read about this in Times, they've seen it when they walk past the monument at rallies and talk to people about these ideologies, but they don't know how to deploy it in the streets. And so what we're doing is this book club, where we're after we go through the book, we're bringing in organizers and ANC members and people who have worked on these issues of abolition as a big bucket. And so that's a bunch of other like slither of issues that go underneath that. Yeah. So, but at the end of it, has to connect to hard policy. Cultural change can preclude policy change, but that doesn't necessitate it.
And policy change won't necessarily have an impact without the cultural change, though. So that's the other piece. So they have to go hand in hand, because if the law isn't enforced, or people don't follow it, or people don't believe in it, it's not going to have the broader systemic impact that we're talking about. So, and I think the centering the people impacted is very important when we're thinking about changing minds and changing hearts. And here, I think it's pretty clear. So particularly when we're thinking of the racial justice component and the part who doesn't have the right to vote, and historically how they've been marginalized and oppressed and harmed, and what it means for them to still not be able to vote, and how those policies impact their lives. So telling some of those stories in this context, I think, can be very effective, just as it is in the Love is Love context. So I think we're done there. Excellent job. Round of applause to our panelists. Thank you so much. That was great. And then Alex, or our organizers, do you want to have a final word?
Yeah, sure. I can jump in. Again, thanks so much to our panelists for coming. We really appreciate it. That was really educational and informative, and I think gives us all kind of an idea of how to move forward, how we can make change, and how we can use our law degrees and our interest in organizing and activism. With that, I think that's all. Calvin, I don't know if you want to post maybe your information for people to get involved in DC organizing, but that could be a good idea to give people some concrete steps moving forward. But otherwise, really appreciate everyone taking the time, and appreciate all the people who came to listen as well.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. Bye.
Thank you.